In the mid-1970s, Van Halen wasn't Van Halen as we know them yet. They were a young, hungry band opening shows, fighting for ears, fighting for inches of stage, and sometimes even fighting for enough power to get through their set. And according to Michael Anthony, one of the toughest tours they ever did was opening for Ted Nugent. Not because the crowds were hostile, not because the music didn't connect, but because the conditions were stacked against them. So let's listen in here to what Michael Anthony had to say about that era and about what it was like to open for Ted Nugent.
These bands, Ted Nugent would open up for him and he wouldn't even give us a sound check. And you kind of got something going on, hey, turn their PA down half the volume of me and give them a quarter of the lights that they were, a lot of bands weren't, hey, just give Van Halen the bare minimum.
Before we dive down into Michael Anthony's comments, let's talk about what the 1970s touring scene was really like for opening acts, because it wasn't very friendly. Headliners controlled the PA, lighting, the schedule, and often budget. Opening bands were expected to play fast, set up quickly, sound good enough but not too good, and never ever outshine the main attraction. This wasn't a personal thing, it was a management call. There were union rules, production limits, and all these things that they had to work around, and so headliners got preferential treatment. But when you're the band on stage, opening for the headliner feels like you're being held back. In that audio clip, Michael Anthony recalled a period when Van Halen was opening for Nugent, and he's saying that they weren't allowed to have proper sound checks, and that their lighting was limited to a fraction of what the headliner had, and that their PA capacity was limited. And from his perspective, this feels deliberate. It feels like sabotage. And he presents that it felt like that at the time, not as like a courtroom accusation, but to show what Van Halen had to overcome. Ted Nugent fans, and frequently most industry veterans, will rightly point out something here, that the way that Van Halen was treated by Ted Nugent and Aerosmith in the 1970s was totally common. There were decisions made by tour managers, production crews, and promoters that had nothing to do with the bands. And in this case, the reality of the situation is that the way that Van Halen was treated as an opening act for Ted Nugent didn't really differ from the way that any opening act was treated. And you can look at some clips, for example, from Neil Peart speaking about when Rush opened for so many bands in the 70s, Aerosmith and Kiss, and he talks about how often they weren't allowed to get a sound check then either. So if anyone thinks that this was a deliberate sabotage, I think they're misreading this situation. There's another thing that may be misunderstood about all of this, which is whether or not this kind of thing actually held Van Halen back. Because even though they were limited to having a fraction of the PA, a fraction of the lighting, a fraction of the time, and they were treated like the underdog, they still blew everyone away. They converted fans night after night, and they built their reputation on word of mouth that spread from exactly these shows. So during this time, they learned how to win with less. They had no safety net, they had no cushion, they had no spectacle to hide behind. They just had to be four musicians who delivered night after night on the stage under somewhat adverse conditions. And this is where I think Michael Anthony's story is really important, because he shows that when you're denied certain comforts, you can respond by becoming sharper. When you're denied space, you can get better at being explosive within that contained area. So Van Halen did all of this. They focused. They made every note count. They made every transition count. Every second on stage mattered, and it paid off. And now there's one more thing I'd like to mention here, which is that Ted Nugent is well known as being a massive supporter of Van Halen, a vocal warrior, if you will, for their legacy. And he has never said a bad word about Van Halen, and the way that they evolved, partially due to opening for Nugent, made them a stronger band. So my conclusion here is that whatever happened behind the scenes, whatever the motivations were, whatever the limitations may have been, Van Halen didn't need any help. They didn't need full lights. They didn't need the biggest PA. They didn't need permission. All they really needed to do is get on stage and play music. And that is the real lesson here of Michael Anthony's story. And I think that's what he's actually driving at. He's not bitter and he's not blaming anyone. He's saying that Van Halen was put in through the test of fire, and they passed that test with flying colors. So if you were there, if you happen to have seen Van Halen as an opening act, let me know how the experience was down there. And if you didn't see them, but you're a fan of Nugent or Van Halen, let me know how you feel about Michael Anthony's comment. I think that the 70s touring world was kind of brutal for bands, but I think it helped to forge the legends that we all love. Let me know your feelings in the comments below.
Music Guru here, asking you to help us on our march to 10,000 subscribers.